Hello and welcome to our final video on cognitive load theory. So in our previous 2 weeks what we've looked at extraneous cognitive load and intrinsic cognitive load, and Neil's done a great job in explaining how we need to reduce the extraneous load and we need to try and build scaffolds and pre-existing knowledge in order to help with the intrinsic cognitive load. Today what we're going to do is look at that last piece of the puzzle, which is what we call the Germain cognitive load, and that's about putting new information into our existing schemas and connecting those two things. Just to recap quickly though, just want to go back over what we were just saying about the two previous things. So we talked about in the first video we talked about extraneous cognitive loads. We know that our working memory is very limited, and therefore when we're trying to present new information, we've got to be really careful that we stick to the one or two very clear ideas that we want to transmit, because anything else acts as just a kind of buffer and will detract from what we're actually trying to achieve. Now, Neil also talked about what we call the intrinsic cognitive loads. That's the complexity of an idea, and he talked about communism. Communism is always going to be a difficult concept. However, the more pre-existing knowledge you have, the easier that will become. And if you scaffold that carefully, if you sequence it carefully, then actually we can simplify the intrinsic cognitive load, because we are obviously providing that scaffolding of knowledge. Now, when we're talking about cognitive load, and remember Dylan William thinks this is one of the most important things that we can learn as a teacher, we're talking about it because we're talking about our working memory. Our working memory is our processing center, and we only have a finite amount of cognitive space in our working memory because it's so limited. Now, the complexity of an idea, or the intrinsic cognitive load, is going to take up some of that cognitive space. The second thing that takes up that cognitive space is what we call the extraneous cognitive load. So if these two things, the intrinsic cognitive load and the extraneous cognitive load, are too big, then what that means is that we fill up all our working memory, we fill up all that cognitive space, and that's when we get cognitive overload. And it might look like we're teaching, we might be presenting to the class, but actually this is the tricky thing in teaching, you never really know what's going on in their brains. Then if there is a cognitive overload, then they're not going to actually be learning anything. You're not connecting it to their existing schema, and it's just like we said before, that cursor coverage, which is a bit like skimming a stone on a river. There's nothing of any depth happening there. So what we've got to try and do is we've got to try and leave space for what we call the Germain cognitive load. That's the connection of the new idea to the existing schema. If there is no space for that, there is no learning. However, so what we've got to try and do is really reduce those other two things so that we've got room, and we've got wiggle room for that Germain cognitive load, for that connection in the working memory to happen, so that we're actually connecting that information to our long-term memory. If, like we said, if we've got this cognitive overload, if we haven't really thought about the clarity, the explicitness, the complexity of the idea, about the main idea, what we actually want to convey, then we're just not leaving any room for actual learning to happen. So what we want to do is, like we just said, is we're trying to simplify, reduce, and then it comes to the connection, and we're trying to make sure that we connect our new information to our existing schema. Now, we can do that one of two ways. The most effective way, and we've talked about this in CPD before, is for the students to have generated that knowledge. So a retrieval exercise on stuff that you've already taught. So it's the students are actually activating their existing schemas. You obviously, through feedback, will correct it if there are any misconceptions. That is probably the most effective way to activate that existing schema, and then you can obviously show those connections to that new information. If you just say, oh, do you remember when we studied that in year 7, or do you remember when we studied that in year 8, that's a kind of limited activation, but actually you don't know, by you doing that you're activating your own schema, but actually you don't really know how much cognitive thought is going on with those students. So what we should always be trying to do when we're teaching a lesson is thinking very carefully in this video particularly, thinking very carefully about what existing knowledge do those students have that I can connect this new piece of information to. The greater the existing knowledge, the easier obviously the new connection is. That's what we talk about when we talk about performance of students on a relative scale. High performing students have got more pre-existing knowledge, and therefore it's easier to connect new information. Students who come with less pre-existing knowledge have got less knowledge, so therefore it's harder initially to connect new information. So you've got to think more carefully about scaffolding. You've got to think more carefully about how many times you want to repeat information in order to try and build schemas within their knowledge, because that's ultimately our job, to try and build schema for all of our students. And we know in last week's session Neil talked about the fact that this is so important because we are trying to build cathedrals for all our students. We can teach in ways that do just advantage the students with very strong pre-existing schemas, or we can teach in ways that tries to benefit all students.